So recording now. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, nice. Paint. Okay, so we're discussing last week. We're talking about configuration manager and the whole concept of installing the client. What that does. We went aside a bit. Just give another quick short recap of what we're talking about. Let's say this were to be a switch in your environment, your typical layer 2 switch in your environment. You have your devices, either clients or servers, connecting to the switch port, a port on the switch. And within these devices, you have operating systems that are running. So the operating systems could be Microsoft Windows operating system, either client server or server operating system. The operating system could be Linux, it could be Unix, it could have Mac devices in your environment. And then somewhere in your infrastructure, you have your configuration manager also connected to a switch. So either living on a virtual host like VMware or Hyper-V, most likely you have your configuration manager server. And the whole point of managing these devices is you have to get a client application, a configuration manager client application installed on these devices. And the communication between your config manager server and this client goes through these client applications. So it's not as if the operating system on this machine is talking with your server directly. It's your server application. So on this server, you have config manager installed. And the whole concept is the config manager server application is communicating. Well, again, we'll break this down a bit. It's communicating with the client application on these devices. So it's really important that in our environment, we need to discover our devices. Much more than devices, we can discover devices or users. And then we have to install the config manager client on the devices so that we can manage them. So, and we've already talked about the different methods that we can use to install the config manager. And then we were started talking a bit about what happens when you're actually installing the config manager client on these devices. So when we're installing it, we mentioned that most likely you'll be running an application called ccmsetup.exe. And you run this application on these devices, on this client. So you can either run them manually or you can run them using a script, using different methods. So you don't have to use this method and you don't have to run it manually. You can use different methods to run that. Okay, so let's make a little bit of progress with this. So again, just to see if we remember what we discussed last week. So does anyone know what the ccmsetup.exe, what it does? Does anyone remember what it does? Chris, shaking your head. So what does the ccmsetup.exe, what does it do?
Well, first of all, it's a wrapper, and it
Excellent.
checks prerequisites, and
Excellent.
if they do not exist, then it installs them.
Excellent. And then after installing the prerequisite, Abdul, what does it do next? Because Abdul was here last week also. If anyone knows the answer, so thanks very much. That was an excellent answer, Chris. So ccmsetup.exe is a wrapper in itself. So what it does a lot of stuff. So it kicks off the process and checks the prerequisites, as Chris said. So after checks if the prerequisite exists, if they don't exist, it downloads and installs them if they don't exist. And after installing the prerequisite, then it calls something else. So what's the next thing that it calls? Does anyone know the answer to that? Yeah, excellent, Abdul. Excellent. So then it calls client.msi, and then client.msi is actually the config manager. So this is actually the config manager client. But the thing is, if you just try to install this, um, it's gonna fail if you don't have the prerequisites already installed on the system. But the reason why this is so good is because it does all this for you. So it checks the prerequisites, downloads them and installs them if they don't exist. If they do, um, it leaves them. If they don't, it downloads and install them. So actually, let's just see a quick demonstration of that. So I'll bring up my computer here. Um, let's see. So let's bring up this computer. So I think I must have some of these machines that are not yet ADFS1. Let's switch this one on. DC1, DC2. I think we have the client on DC2 already. Let me start this server. Um, okay, so this one might not have it. Might not have the client already. If we can get into it. Okay, so let's log into this. So what we can do is just do a quick demonstration and see behind the scene of what actually goes on. So this will help us in case we need to troubleshoot this. So it's already installed on this one. So actually I'll uninstall it from this one also. So here's one other important things to notice. Let's go ccmsetup.exe slash uninstall. And go client. Okay, here we go. We have a client device here. So this client device is already joined to the domain. And what has happened in the background is we've already, as we've discussed in previous Hangout, we've already configured Configuration Manager, this application, to go into Active Directory and discover systems from there. So we've configured Active Directory. So Abdul says cost client.msi starts the installation. It will also it will install also SCCM and Software Center. Is it correct? Yes, it will. So it's going to install every single component of the config manager client. So now remember that installation and enabling them are two different things. So it's going to install them, whether you're going to be using that or not, it's going to install them on the machine. So let's see, actually we can see all the things which is some of the things that we'll see now. So again, we've enabled Active Directory system discovery. So Configuration Manager has spoken with Active Directory, discovered systems in Active Directory. So if I go under Asset and Compliance, you'll see my systems that are joined to the Active Directory domain already discovered here. So this is the one that we want to install the client on. So it's been discovered, but client is not installed on it. So let's go and try to install the client on this. So like we said, we can run it manually. I can go on my configuration manager server, which is lb SCCM2 that goes through. So I can go on my configuration manager server and just, install the client directly from there. I can do that. Or another thing I can do is I can use different other method like group policy, pushing. I can use logon script. Just make sure this guy is LD and okay. And then this one is really slow. Not sure why it's really slow. Okay. So I'll just check that firewall is disabled. So let's go check the firewall. Okay, I'll just again in a production environment, this is not what you probably do. You probably won't disable your firewalls. You probably just want to open. Let's go. Sorry, I got my wife again. Yeah. Okay. So let's go back. She's back again. You can see her. Sorry. Uh,
You cracked me up too.
screen one. Go back to yeah. She just comes to disturb. That's not responding. Maybe this one will. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's just use this one. Okay. So here we are. Long client one is responding. Long client two is not responding. We won't be looking into that. But here we are. The folder that the config manager does the starts the installation from is this folder called ccmsetup.exe. So I remember some moment ago, or in the past Hangout, Abdul guided us as to how to enable something called client push installation, which is basically we make sure that a config manager we configure an account that has local admin rights on all our machines, and which we've done in this case already. So I can go under here, go under client push installation, and go under account. So I have this account configured already, and this account has local administrator rights on my client machines. So that's Lightbulb, SCCM, CP standing for client push. So if I go on the domain controller and check, um, or actually I can just check it from the SCCM server itself. So I can go to my SCCM server, bring up PowerShell, and let's get the user, actually get the principal group membership, um, SCCM CP. Let's see if that gets us the client members of that group. Oh, sorry, of this account. Yeah, here we go. Let's make this bigger. Font 16 by 12 or 12 by 16 will be good. Yeah, here we go. So this account is a member of this group called Global Workstation Admins. And Global Workstation Admins is a group that I've used group policy. So if I go on my domain controller, by group policy, I've configured this group to have local admin rights on all my clients. So if I bring up group policy management and um, I think I've probably done that maybe uh, client. Okay. So if I go edit this group policy object, actually I can just go under settings here and expand what the settings are. So again, I've created a group called Workstation Admins. Um, I've created a group called Workstation Admins, and I've given that group their group policy. Um, okay, maybe this one. Yeah, okay, here we go. Using restricted groups, I've configured this group policy settings to say global workstation admins are member of built-in administrators. And I think there's a recording that we have on YouTube that shows how to do this kind of configuration, group policy configuration to set local admins um, on different machines in your domain. So we've done that. So that account has local administrator rights on the machines. And the other thing that we can do from our SCCM server configuration is we can go under installation properties and specify different installation properties there. So what this means is that the installation properties will control what the configuration of the client will be when you install it. For example, I can come here and go disable site option equals to true. I can set this option and go apply. Now, whenever I go and push this client installation to a machine, after the configuration manager client is installed, there's an option that you can use to change the site. So that option will be disabled on the client because I have this stated here. So I can go and say SMS cache size equals to 10240 equals to 10 gig. That's in megabytes, equals to 10 gig. So what that will do is whenever the client is installed on the machine, from now on, the cache size, which is where SCCM temporarily downloads any software or any source files that is going to be installing, so the cache size will be set to 10 gig. So there's a whole lot of options that I can configure using this method. So if we go to Microsoft, let's bring up a web page, new window. And let me bring up this Microsoft. So if that goes through, I can make the. Is it this one? Not this one. Let's try something another one. Okay, client installation properties, this one. And I'll make this bigger. So you can see a lot of properties that we can configure. So we can go put a lot of the switches in, and that controls the behavior of the client wasn't installed. So I can use some of these, like this one, disable site option. So if set to true, disables the ability of end users with administrative credentials on client computer to change the configuration manager assigned site. So there's different stuff. So disable cache option, I can set it to true. I can use this to say, hey, I want the cache directory to be located somewhere else. So there's a lot of different options that we can configure here. But the main thing to notice here is back to the whiteboard, is that there are different settings for CCM setup. So it has different switches, and client.msi also has its own different switches. Now, what do we mean by that? What that means is this. So I can go and say ccmsetup.exe, and I can control the behavior of the installation. So ccmsetup.exe has its own switches. Switches like exclude feature, and I can say exclude feature client UI. But what I can also do with ccmsetup.exe is I can pass the switches for client.msi. I can give them to ccmsetup.exe, and ccmsetup.exe will pass them to client.msi. So just to break it down again, what that means is this. If I were to be installing, let's bring up another whiteboard. If I were to be installing client.msi, so again, ccmsetup.exe is the wrapper, client.msi is the actual configuration manager client. Client.msi has different switches that you can use to control its behavior, like the ones that we've mentioned, like disable site option equals to true. This is a switch that belongs to client.msi. ccmsetup.exe has no idea what to do with this switch. But what you can do is whenever you're running ccmsetup.exe, I can say ccmsetup.exe and say disable side option equals to true. And what ccmsetup.exe is, it will recognize this as a switch that belongs to client.msi. So after it does everything like check the prerequisite, install the prerequisite, so whenever it's calling client.msi, it will pass these switches and pass it to client.msi and say, hey, here are some switches for you to use whenever you're running. So even though ccm.setup.exe adds its own different switches that it can use um, when the installation is running, you can also use switches for client.msi, which it will pass over, because this can confuse many people. Like, for example, let's go back to the Microsoft page and we'll see that information here. So if I scroll all the way back up and let's bring this one, make it this one this way. Okay. And I'll just make this one still bigger, but not as big as before. Okay. Um, so you see, it says here, it says ccmsetup.exe provides several command line properties to customize the installation behavior. So one is customizing the installation behavior. The other is customizing the client behavior. So ccmsetup.exe provides several command line properties to customize the installation behavior. Additionally, you can also specify properties to modify the behavior of client.msi at the ccmsetup.exe command line. And then it gives a very important one in here. It says you must specify all required CCM setup properties before you specify properties for client setup.msi. So if I want to modify the installation, for example, if I scroll down, let's just minimize all this ccmsetup.exe command line option. So it gave an example here. It said, for example, ccmsetup.exe. So usually the switches that have a forward slash in front of them belong to ccmsetup.exe. Switches that don't have a forward slash in front of them belong to client.msi. But what he's saying is you must specify, I can't go and put slash logon after FSP here. So you must specify CCM setup properties first and then put the one for client.msi after. So you can mix and match. I can go CCM setup, I can use this one and go this way and go um, this way, but put slash logon on this one and put them after here. So that won't work because this belongs to ccmsetup.exe for the installation behavior. This one belongs to client.msi for the client is whenever it's configuring the client. So for example, slash logon, we say to ccmsetup.exe, hey, check the client before you begin the installation. Check to see if there's an existing client installed. If there's an existing client installed, don't proceed. So this is the one that you use if you're using a logon script to install the client. So if you're using CCM, so you're using a logon script, you have a batch file, you say ccmsetup.exe, you have to put slash logon. Otherwise, what will happen is every time the user logs into the machine, it's going to reinstall the client. But if you put slash logon, what that will make sure is that CCM setup, before it begins anything, it's going to check if the client is installed first. If it's installed, it's not going to install it again. So that's the one. So if you scroll down and you expand this and you go under slash logon, you see specifies that the client installation should stop if any version of System Center 2012 Configuration Manager client is already installed. So that belongs to ccmsetup.exe. But again, remember you put that of ccmsetup.exe, you put the switches first, and then you put the switches for client.msi afterwards. So then if I keep scrolling down, so all this one you see, they all start with forward slash, they belong to ccmsetup.exe, they can control the behavior. But then down here, there's client.msi properties, which will now control the way the client will be configured when it's installed. So those are the two main things to note here. So let's go back to our client machines now. And what I'll do is, okay, I've added certain options here. Disable site option equals to true. I'll click apply. And so my account is a local admin. I've configured the client's push installation settings. So I'll go to asset and compliance. I'll go to client one. I'll right click on it and go install client. And we'll actually trace and see what's going on. So before I actually do this, let's go back to client one and let's make sure that we have certain things running so we can capture what's going on when it starts. So CCM setup, logs. So actually what I'll do on this machine is I'll delete these two folders completely. So skip, okay. Said it's in use by something. Um, details. Yeah, okay, let's just leave that. So let's see what happens if I go and trigger this from the server and go install the client on this machine. Next, close. So now let's go back to learn client, LB client one and see what happens. So yeah, if you look under task manager, you notice that there's no ccmsetup.exe. So shortly, I expect ccmsetup.exe to start. And it's already started because you can see there's something going on in this folder. You can see it's downloading stuff here. And now you can see ccmsetup.exe started. And what it's actually doing is that you can see that it's beginning to download some files. So actually, let's go open the log, CCM setup, and see what's going on. So this log is dynamic. So you can see some of the things we mentioned. It's checking, does this prerequisite exist? It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start downloading them. So, and it's doing all that in the background. So you see, if I go back to this one, you can see it's downloading all the prerequisites. You can see them. So it's like what we're doing. So it's triggered it instantly. You see that come up in Task Manager, ccmsetup.exe. Instantly, it's looking at the log and checking, hey, do you exist on this machine? If you don't exist, I'll start downloading them. And then after that, I'm going to start installing them. So after it finishes the installation, so you can see installing this one here. So if I make this one bigger, um, let's see, is there a way to make this bigger window? I'm not sure if there's a way to make this bigger actually. Preferences. Can't see a way to make it bigger, sorry. I hope this is clear though. But it says installing Visual C++ redistributable with the option of no restart. So that's what it's doing here. So after that, it's going to say, hey, I finished installing it. Then the next one is going to say, I'm installing Silverlight. So here, ccmsetup.exe is running. And what it's doing is it's installing the prerequisite. At this point, when it finishes, you see MSI exec kicking. So whenever you see MSI exec kicking, that is ccmsetup.exe handing over to client.msi and saying, client.msi, it's your turn to install the client now. So at that point, so if you're looking in Task Manager, first of all, you see ccm.setup.exe running, and then at some points later, you see MSI exec start. So if you're troubleshooting this and you do a client push and you notice CCM setup start, go look in this folder, make sure that it's downloaded like all the prerequisites it needs to download. And then the other thing we need to point out is remember all the settings that we're setting to say this is how you're going to do the installation. All the client settings that were when we set in client push, we configure some settings here to say use these settings whenever you're doing the installation. What happens is whenever I configure the settings on the site server itself, if I go under C program files, config manager, under bin, under x64, whatever the architecture is, and I go under um, maybe under x86, under this one. We go under mobile. Yeah, here we go. Look at this file here. Anything I configure here, it's going to be published in Active Directory, but it's also going to be stored in a file on the site server. So if I open this file with Notepad, you can see that within this file is all the settings. So what will happen is whenever you trigger that on the client, it's going to download this file, and that's where it's going to be reading all the settings from. So again, if I go back to the client now, you notice that the client has downloaded this file here, and that's where it's reading all the settings from to know how to configure the client. So you can see the settings that I configured of the site code, disable site option, SMS cache size. It stored everything in this file. So it downloads this file, and that's what it's going to be passing to the installer. So whenever it gets to the point, it's going to pass this to MSI exec to client.msi, which will install it using these options. So again, if I go back to the log file, let's bring the log file back up. And now you can see it's completed. It said CCM setup is exiting with return code 0. Return code 0 means there's no error, means it's completed successfully. And if I go on the task manager now, there's no more ccmsetup.exe. There's now ccmexec.exe, which is the process for configuration manager. And then at this point, the client is installed on this machine. So if I go on the, again, under CCM setup, on the logs, so the logs to look for are ccmsetup.log. So this log file contains what's going on in the background, the one that we're looking at. So whenever it finishes, it's going to hand over to client.msi. So client.msi shows what client.msi, I'm sorry, client.msi.log shows what client.msi is doing whenever it's doing the installation of the client. So let's open client.msi and see what's going on. Does anyone have any questions regarding what we mentioned now, regarding what's going on in the background, and just seeing a demonstration of, hey, that's actually what it's doing in the background. It's reading the whole list and checking. So this is client.msi, this is log file, and client.msi just basically installs the client. It says this is the product that I'm installing, client side and UI is none and basic, and just goes ahead and installs that. And then if you have any issues during the installation process, what you want to do is check these two log files, ccmsetup.exe and client.msi. The default cache size, that's a very good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I've thought it's 5 gig or so. Or maybe it's in under here. So if I go SMS cache size, let's see if it has a default settings mentioned there. Let's see, SMS cache size. Yeah, so it defaults to a maximum of 5 gig. So the default is 5 gig, Abdul. But the general rule with this is that you configure the cache to be the size of the largest application that you'll be deploying with SCCM. So let's say you're going to be deploying things like uh, Microsoft Office Professional 2016, and let's say it's 10 gig in size. So if you're going to be deploying something that's 10 gig in size, obviously you have to increase this from 5 gig to 10 gig. Because anything you're going to be deploying on the client, it first of all has to download them into the cache first and then run them. So if you're going to be deploying an application that's 20 gig, you have to change this to the size of the application that you're using. Or some people can just go and say, hey, just use whatever disk space you can use. There's no limitations. So you can go use one of the options here to configure that. So actually, let's just confirm that the properties that we've set, let's confirm that they've applied when the client was installed. So what I can do is go under control panel, and I can see the configuration manager applet here in control panel. So if I click on that, and let's see. So it's assigned itself to a management point, which we'll talk about in a minute. Component. So you can see that all these components are installed. But hey, you can see that some of them are enabled, some of them are saying installed. So installed means, hey, I've installed you, but you've not been enabled. So how to enable them, we'll talk about that also very shortly. So how to enable them, this based on client settings, or whatever you set in your client settings depends on what it's going to enable. So for example, software inventory agent is enabled by default. So I can go and disable that in client settings, and then whenever this computer gets a recent policy, it's going to set this to disabled. So this is one way to confirm if your machine has downloaded the policy from the configuration manager server. So if you go here and you see that some components are enabled already, it means that your client has downloaded the policy from the config manager server. So under actions, yeah, under site, look at this. This option is grayed out. That's the option for disable site opt that we configured and set to true. So if I didn't set that to true, and a user with admin right can go configure settings and change the site code here. So here you can change the site code. I'm pressing backspace, nothing is happening, and I can't click on configure settings because that's disabled. So if I go under cache size, so um, if I go configure settings, so you can see the cache size is set to 10240, which is what we configured it to. So that's the client.msi settings. That's different from CCM setup settings. Any question regarding that before we go ahead? Yeah, Abdul, any questions? 1 minute. Anyone has any questions regarding that? So let's see if we remember some of the things that we mentioned. So again, I'll go back to ccmsetup.exe, and this will help us to see, and actually we'll probably run it again, but it will help us to see if we remember one of the things we talked about with ccmsetup.exe like 2 Hangout ago. So let's see when this thing started, and let's see what happened. 2141. How to move cache folder to another drive. So again, that's another switch. I think there's a switch called Abdul. There's a switch called SMS cache. This one, SMS cache directory. So specifies the location of the client cache folder on the client computer, which stores temporary files. By default, the location is Windows directory CCM cache. So you can use this one and say, hey, I want you not to be in this location. I want you to be in this location. So again, remember, so there's like different variations to this. This is important because if you're installing this, so think about this. If you're installing this by client push, you have to specify the settings under the client push installation settings, right? Where we typed in the settings. If you're doing this manually, you have to type this in the command line with ccmsetup.exe. But here's the thing. There are some things that you can achieve if you're doing a manual installation that you can't achieve if you're doing a client push installation. I'll give you an example. Look at this option for ccmsetup.exe. So there's this option here that says exclude features. So this option belongs to ccmsetup.exe. It doesn't belong to client.msi. Now the options, if I'm using client push installation, the only options that I can specify are client.msi options. So again, if I go back here, look at this. Let's specify any client.msi installation properties that you require. Do not specify installation properties for ccmsetup.exe. So if you want to specify properties for ccmsetup.exe, where do you specify that? I don't know. I know you can specify it from here. I'm not sure if you can hack this file because there's a file that it delivers to the client. I've not tested it yet. I've not really seen any documentation on it. I'm not sure if you can hack this file to include CCM setup properties. But all I know is that for client push, you can only use client.msi properties. But one of the properties that ccmsetup.exe has that client.msi does not have is this one. This one says the features you want to exclude whenever you are installing the client. So for example, some people don't want to, whenever you install the client, there are two components that are installed. Actually, there's more than two components, but there are two GUI components. That is components that you can interact with a graphical interface that are installed. On that control panel, there's a configuration manager applet that's installed. And then under all programs on your machine, you find um, this one called Software Center. Yeah, here we go. Microsoft System Center Software Center is also installed. If I'm installing using a manual method, I can pass the switch and say ccmsetup.exe / exclude feature client UI. Then I put out the remaining settings for client.msi, the location of the cache, the size of the cache. So what that will do is that it installs the client, but it doesn't install the software center. But I don't know of any way that you can achieve that with client.msi properties. So I'm not sure if anyone knows of a way to achieve that. So if I install that with client push, I will get software center. But I can exclude that by using, so if I use logon script, I can exclude that because I can set ccmsetup.exe switches manually because I'm using a script. So I just have maybe a batch script, ccmsetup.exe / exclude feature this. I can use a manual method where I log into a machine and just go ccmsetup.exe / do this. Actually, like Microsoft has a good documentation about this. Yeah, I think it's this one. So about client installation properties published to Active Directory domain services. That's the title of the documentation. We talk about this where client push installation. Client push installation does not use Active Directory. Yeah, we talked about this one also. It said, instead, you can specify client.msi installation properties. But it didn't mention that you can specify CCM setup properties. It said you don't have to specify them, but what if I want to specify one of them like, hey, Chris, you're asking a question. I can't hear, sorry.
No, actually, I was just reading the note about you do
Oh,
not have to specify.
yeah, this one. Yeah, so it says you don't have to specify it, but what if I want to specify the option for don't install software center? I don't know of a place where I can configure that in client push and say, hey, don't install software center. But if you're using just ccmsetup.exe and you're specifying the switch, you can use / exclude feature to achieve that. So it says if you're using software update point-based installation, it does not support the addition of installation properties to the ccmsetup.command line. If no command line properties have been provisioned on the client computer by using group policy. So what that means is this. So this may actually be, I'm not sure if this is, no, I don't think this will work for client push, but this is a way to achieve that. So let's say I'm installing configuration manager client by group policy. Now in group policy, you can say run this MSI, right, on this computer, but you can't specify the command line say run this MSI / this one / that one. You can specify that. So how do you specify that on your machine if you're using group policy method? So what they've done, does anyone want to answer that question first? If I'm using group policy installation method, how do I specify these properties that I can specify here using client push method? How do I specify that option using group policy method? Anyone want to answer the question? Anyone has any how that works? Yep.
I'm going to take a guess at
Yep.
this only from what I've been listening.
Yeah.
First, the ccmsetup.exe.
Yeah.
The switch comes first.
Yep.
After the switch comes the SMS cache dir, or whatever you're going to use with the equal sign, followed by quotes and
Yep.
location.
Yep.
Is that
So
correct?
so that's so
I know.
you won't be able to do that with
Okay.
group policy, because again, if I want to do like software installation by group policy, if I go new package and my config manager package is located here. Let me find the location. So LB SCCM2 and SMS site UK2 on the client. Um, so again, we can't use this one for. Again, remember the thing that we're discussing. Abdul, do you remember this? That you can use .exe whenever you're using group policy. But
Right.
yeah, if you go to use client.msi, you're not going to
Hmm.
get all the benefit of all this. So they've provided another one called ccmsetup.msi. Remember that conversation, Abdul? Chris remembers. So yeah, so that conversation. So now I have to specify I think that's located on the program files, config manager, and I think it might be located on the bin, under somewhere here. Then here we go, ccmsetup.msi. So this is a .msi file. So I can go and say this is the one I want to. So specify using group policy. Enter ccmsetup.msi. Assigned. I can go. Yeah, but
So you'd have to use the .msi with the group policy. That's for sure for pushing it out.
yes, but again, it's not, you won't be using client.msi, you'll be using another package. So there's a third package that you only use for group policy called ccmsetup.msi. So there's ccmsetup.exe, there's client.msi, which is the client itself. But then for group policy, because you can only use .msi with group policy, yeah, exactly. So Abdul is correct. So because you can only use that, yeah. So then there's another one which you only use for group policy, which is ccmsetup.msi, which is like an MSI version of ccmsetup.exe. So it's ccmsetup.exe, ccmsetup.msi. So now I can specify that, but hold on, I can't specify any switches anywhere. But what Microsoft has done, if you're using group policy method, so that what Abdul said is right. I can go under Windows component here. Okay, not under Windows component, under admin template, and they've provided some templates that we can use to configure that. So what I can do is if I go back to my config manager server here, and I go back on the config manager server, my installation folder, under this folder called tools, and I'll see this configuration manager ADM template. So that location, I'll see some templates that I can import into group policy, and I can use them to configure the switches. So what I can do is actually, let me just import this template now. So what I've done is I've opened a group policy object, went to add and remove templates, go to add, and just go to the location of those templates. They're on the config manager server, and just import both of them and go open, close. And then if I go here, there's under classic administrative template, I can expand and I can see configuration manager 2012 here now. So if I expand this, there are two major settings. One, configuration manager site assignment, which again we'll talk about to explain in a bit. And then configure configuration manager client deployment settings. So this is the one I'll use. So look at what this setting says. It said enabling this policy supersedes the client deployment properties configured in the configuration manager console, blah, blah, blah. So what it says is that, A, you can use this to specify settings for CCM setup. So I can go enable and go all the switches that we mentioned, like forward slash exclude, sorry, forward slash exclude feature client UI, and then go ahead and specify the ones for client.msi also, like SMS cache size equals 10240. So I can specify all this here and apply this group policy to my whole U. And what this will do is that this will apply, it will apply the, uh, sorry, I'm smiling because I'm having, I'm having my wife here again. So what this will do is that this will apply, it will apply the settings into certain registry keys. So again, we've done like Hangout on group policies and all that, and we'll probably still do more. But group policy settings, majority of them, not in every situation, but majority of group policy settings are registry settings. So, for example, in group policy settings, we've talked about this in the past. You have computer configuration. If you go under your registry key, you have something like HKLM. So most policies that you find there are just manipulating registry keys under HKLM. You find user configuration here. Most group policy settings you're changing here are just modifying registry keys under HKey current user. Most of them, again, not in every situation, but most of them. So what this particular setting will do is that under the registry key for configuration manager, it will go in and put these options here that I've configured. So whenever the group policy applies, it's going to go and check those registry keys and says, hey, registry keys, any settings that's been configured for me to apply, yeah, here are the settings. So whenever it kicks off CCM setup, it kicks them up with whatever option you've specified in this group policy setting. So the one for group policy is a bit different. But the good thing though is that this template you can use them for other different methods apart from group policy method. So you can use this method for a manual installation, for example. So what I can do on the machines, if the machines are domain joined, I can configure these switches within this group policy settings, right? And if I go on the machine, I don't need to specify them on the command line anymore. I can just go ccmsetup.exe, enter, and it's going to read them from the registry. So here's the way ccmsetup.exe work. Let's bring up our whiteboard again so we understand it more. So ccmsetup.exe has installation switches, right? So here is the process it follows to read them. So the first one is manually specified. So in other words, whenever I go ccmsetup.exe, it's going to check, have you specified anything manually on the command line? That is, if I've gone and said ccmsetup.exe /logon and entered all these, it's going to go, yep, you've specified it manually. That's what I'm going to use. If you've entered ccmsetup.exe without specifying anything manually, here's what's going to do. It's going to go, hey, somebody has entered ccmsetup.exe, but there's no switches. Anything specified manually? No. Anything in the registry key, which is again group policy. So the next one is registry key / group policy. So it's going to say anything specified for installation switches in the registry key or group policy, which is where it's going to go and read them from. Is like, so basically I can go ccmsetup.exe and not specify anything manually. If I've configured them using that group policy setting, which configures the registry key, it's going to just go ahead and apply all those options. So if those ones are not set, then the next thing is, who knows what the next one is that it's going to look for. So where is it going to look for? The settings. So again, we're not even talking about client. We're not talking about site assignment. We're not talking about management point. We're just talking about purely installation here. So where else is it going to look for with regards to the installation switches? So it's like, have you specified anything manually? No. Have you set anything in group policy registry key? No. Where else will it look for? Abdul, do you know where else it's going to look for? Where else will it? Well, site server. Not site server. Well, it's going to look on a server, but not site server. I've not asked Bob any questions. So Bob, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if you've used management point. No, not management point. Bob, have you used config manager at all? So do you know where it looks for again? If it's not specified manually, if it's not specified by registry key, do you know where else it looks for? Yeah.
I don't know.
No problem. It's all right. So that's in Active Directory, Abdul. It's going to look in Active Directory. Because let's look on the server. So let's look back on our config manager server here. Minimize this and I go LB SCCM. Look at this. It says specify any client.msi installation properties that you require when you install the configuration manager client software. Do not specify installation properties for ccmsetup.exe. So client push installation properties, right? Let's go on Microsoft documentation and see. Client push installation properties. Client push installation properties. Client push installation properties, and it's brought us back to the same page we were on before. But if we scroll down, one of the things I expect it to mention is now look at this. Let's minimize this just one bit. Okay. Can you still see this option? Can you see this at all? Is it clear? Or do I need to extend and make it larger? Can you read it?
Can you make it just a little larger?
Yep. Let's make it larger. But yeah.
That's perfect.
Okay. Now let's see this one. It says if you have extended the Active Directory schema for SCCM. So again, you see that's the reason why extending the Active Directory schema and doing all this operation Active Directory, it's not something that's necessary, it's not mandatory, it's something that's optional. But it's something that has a lot of benefit if you do that. I actually just recorded a video yesterday about installing configuration manager. I just recorded one yesterday about installing config manager. Yeah, this one. Install a configuration manager 2012 how to where I actually showed um, the way to extend the AD schema and all that. But what this would do is that if you've extended the AD schema for System Center Configuration Manager, many client installation properties are published in Active Directory domain services and read automatically by the System Center 2012 Configuration Manager client. So then it says for a list of client installation properties that are published in Active Directory, look at this information. So what he's saying is that so back to my server again, whatever I'm typing here is going to publish this information in Active Directory. So what that means is that I can actually go on my client again and actually just type ccmsetup.exe without typing any switches, and it's going to read them directly from Active Directory. So it goes through this process. Have you specified anything manually? Have you set anything by registry key or good policy? If not, is anything published in Active Directory? So this is installation. This is not talking because this can confuse many people because configuration manager is really wide and it can get confusing with many things. So this is just talking about installation. And again, remember, we're just talking about installation. We already have two types of switches. One for ccmsetup.exe, one for one for client.msi. There are some situations where you cannot specify. For example, if it's going to be reading them from Active Directory, you really can't specify client.msi. ccmsetup.exe because anything that is published in Active Directory comes from the ones in Config Manager, and the only ones you can set in Config Manager are client.msi settings. So in this case, it's only going to be client.msi settings that you can configure here. So except if anyone knows of another way, I don't know of a way to configure this from within Configure Manager, to configure ccmsetup.exe switches from within Configuration Manager. I've not seen a way to do it. There may be a way, so if anyone finds a way, please just post it in the community or something. But the only one, because again, if we go back to the server, it mentions it clearly. Specify any client.msi installation properties. Do not specify installation properties for ccmsetup.exe. So what if I want to use ccmsetup.exe switches? I have no idea how I'm going to configure that from within Configuration Manager console. So you can configure that using group policy. If I go to my domain controller, I can go under the group policy setting here. If I enable this, hey, this is for CCM setup. This is not for client.msi. This is for CCM setup, which will handle switches for both CCM setup and client.msi. So I can use CCM setup.exe switches here, but from config manager. So this one is only for, so manually you can specify both ccm setup.exe switches, both ccmsetup.exe and client.msi switches. So you can use that if you're specifying it manually. If you're going to be using registry key group policy, you can use switches for both. If it's by Active Directory, you can only use client.msi settings because, again, this comes from config manager and you can only specify client.msi settings there. So that's the process that follows. And then whenever it finds the settings, then it goes ahead and triggers and goes through the process of, hey, so again, let's go through it slowly. You run ccmsetup.exe, either manually or by client push, whichever method you're using, ccmsetup.exe runs, whichever way. So it runs that, it says, okay, any switch is configured for me. Is it specified manually? I'm going to use that. It's specified by registry key. You mean I can use only ccmsetup.exe only with manual installation, not only with manual installation. So, because again, remember, like, if you use a logon script, will you call a logon script manual installation? No. Yeah. So a logon script is not manual installation. But if you use a logon script, I go and I say the logon script, and I have a batch file, and inside the batch file, I can have a single command and say run // file server /config manager /ccm setup.exe. That may be the only line in my logon script. And anyone that logs in that this logon script applies to, it's just going to trigger this ccm setup.exe. And once it triggers it, it goes through this process. A, is anything specified manually? You've not specified it manually within the script, so that's okay. The next thing, have you configured anything by group policy or registry? So if you've configured it by group policy, you can use it in this way. So Abdul, so the answer is by client push. I know because to rephrase your question, so that means we cannot use ccmsetup.exe switches by using client push method. As far as I know, there's no way to do that. So you can use it using any other method, but by client push method, I'm sure that you can probably hack, this file. I've not played with it at all. So this particular file, I'm sure you can probably, because that's where all the settings that client push is using, that's where it comes from. So I'm sure that you can probably go and say, because again, when we triggered the config manager installation, it began to download a lot of stuff. If you noticed, it began to download a lot of stuff. One of the first things it downloaded was it downloaded ccmsetup.exe, ccmsetup.cab, and it downloaded this file here, mobile client.tcf. And this is where all the options that it's using for the installation, this is where it has stored them. So I'm sure that we can probably manipulate this particular file, maybe by saying ccmsetup.exe equals, ccmsetup.exe, and put the switches here. I've not tried it before. If you manipulate this particular file and add some modifications, whether it's going to apply that, I'll probably test that out, maybe do a recording on it or something. Please copy what's on the whiteboard on chat window so I can paste it. Okay, no problem. You mean this one, right? Okay. Just copy it and paste. No problems. There you go. Yeah. So again, so it runs that. So the other thing is after it now finishes running config manager, it's installed the client, no problems. Then the next thing after installation, because these steps are really important to separate them from one another, is it goes into site assignment. And we discussed that last week. We discussed that a lot last week to say site assignment is different. Site assignment means a client is being assigned to which type of site, Chris? Which type of site can you assign a client to? Because there are three types of sites, but you can only assign a client to only one type of site. Remember, we mentioned this primary site, the secondary site.
Right. Secondary. I believe it is only the primary site.
Excellent. So After the client is installed, now the client is have installed. But where do I get my policies from is the next question, right? So
Mhm.
you've run system setup.exe, whatever method, whatever switches you've used, now the client is installed. Now it goes, where do I get my policies from? The only way I can get my policies from somewhere is if I'm assigned to a site. So the next step is I have to assign myself to a site. It goes through a set of process again of site assignment. The first thing it looks for is, has anything been specified manually? So during the installation here, I could have gone ccmsetup.exe and I could have gone SMS site code equals to learn. So in other words, I'm manually specifying this is your site. So whenever it finishes the installation, it just goes, yeah, I've been configured with the site already. You remember client.msi reads this one and says, yeah, I've been configured to assign you to site so and so. So site so and so will you be assigned to? So it looks at that and says, has this been specified manually? And then it assigns you to that site. If not, the next thing it goes is, can I read this information from Active Directory? That's the next thing it does. Again, which is one of the benefits of doing the Active Directory schema extension. Even though it's not optional, it's something that can help because it goes, is something excellent, Abdul. So after it says, oh, I can't find anything in Active Directory, it can go DNS, for example. So let's actually see where the records are stored in Active. I know we've seen this before, but if I go to the domain controller here and go domain controller, bring up Active Directory, and if I bring up system management, here's where the information is stored. So whatever is publishing, it publishes there. So at the moment, I don't think I have, do I have any sites? So because I can't see any site code here. So let's go back to my config manager server and let's see what's going on. Because I may not have configured my boundary groups, or if I've configured my boundary groups, go under properties, site. Yep, let's use this for site assignment. This. So the other thing I need to just make sure is because I know I was deleting a lot of stuff on my because of the expiration, the other thing expired. Um, okay, here we go. I just needed to do a refresh, and yeah, here we go. So yeah, you can see this thing configured here. It's called SMS site UK2, right? So this is this config manager has published this to Active Directory. Let's open this. Let's see the properties. Attribute editor. Let me filter out and show only the attributes that has values in them. So if I scroll down, I see, I'll see here, oh, here we go. There's this attribute within this object that config manager published. Says MS SMS roaming boundaries, London sites. In other words, let me open Active Directory sites and services. Oh, look at this London site. So what this means is any machine that belongs to London site in Active Directory, your site code is UK2. So it can read this information to assign itself because if your machine, again, remember if your machine joins the domain, right? You log into your machine, it locates a domain controller, right? It does all the domain controller location stuff. It determines which site am I in, right? So it determines the site based on its subnet. It's like, I mean, my IP address is 172.16.1.1. Which subnet am I located in? Which site is that assigned to in Active Directory? And it's like, oh, I'm assigned to this site. Which domain controllers are in this site? Which domain controller is closest to me? So it's like, okay, I'm in London site. These are the domain controllers in my site. So what we can use is use the same process that we already use for Active Directory location for site assignment in Config Manager so that machines can go, which site am I in Active Directory? Oh, I'm in the London site. Oh, what is my Config Manager site? Oh, your Config Manager site is this. Let's do a little play here. I know we've demonstrated this before, but remember, look at this. We have this object, SMS site UK2. You can see this option here has London site within it. So any machine that's configured for the London site are automatically assigned to this configuration manager site code UK2. what I can do is if I go back to my config manager server, I can go and say, I can go and create a new boundary group. I have different boundaries. Okay, Birmingham site. Okay, let's create a new boundary group for Birmingham boundary group. Create boundary group, Birmingham boundary group, and say anyone in the Birmingham site in Active Directory, you're in the Birmingham boundary group. References. Use this boundary group for site assignment. Okay, let me enable that. And say, hey, because I have only one primary site, anyone in this boundary group, assign them to this site, UK2. And I go apply and okay, done, right? Now, the information I've configured here, config manager takes it and publishes it to Active Directory. So let's go back to Active Directory. So very shortly, under MS SMS roaming boundaries, Birmingham site should appear here very shortly. So if I cancel out of this and refresh this, and let's go back to the properties, go back to the attributes, and here we go. It didn't take long. Birmingham site, London site. So now any machine from the Birmingham site can use their Active Directory site location to determine I'm assigned to site UK2. So that's the next thing that happens is site assignment. Hey, manually Active Directory, is it an Active Directory? Maybe I've not done Active Directory. It can also use DNS. So let's go to DNS. Does it use DNS for site assignment? Site assignment. Abdul, does it use DNS for site assignment? Because I think that may be wrong. DNS for site assignment. Are you confident that it uses DNS for site assignment? I'm not so confident. Forward lookup zone. So if I expand this and I go on the okay, go under my domain, my domain here, so I can see MS. So actually, I don't think it uses this for site assignment. I think it uses this to locate management point, but not for site assignment, Abdul. I think DNS doesn't apply here. So again, which is why some of these things, yeah. So again, which is why some of these things can be. Abdul said, "Aha, yeah, it's true." Some of these things, because it's so wide. There's a lot of things going on. Now look at all these things we were talking about, and then you go for a course. Yeah, baby. Yeah, feel free, please. No, camera is not on. Sorry. Thanks. Yeah. Okay. So config manager, sorry for that. So config manager wants to, so look at all these processes is going through. A ccmsetup.exe, are the switches configured? Is it manually? Is it registry key? Is it configured in Active Directory? Well, I can only use client.msi if it's configured using Active Directory. Then the next thing I have to assign myself to a site, and all this can be really, really crazy. Or the other thing I can do is, if I've said manually, Active Directory, there's another thing I can configure in config manager called fallback site, which can even be much more confusing, noting that there's something called fallback status point, and these two are different, completely different. So people are like, you just mentioned fallback site, fallback status points, everything is confusing, what's going on and all this. So so what that means is that I have no place to configure. I've not found any information to use to configure my site. I'm going to go for the default site. So this is kind of like the default site. If you can't find a specific site assignment manually Active Directory, use this site assignment. So the way to configure that, if I go to config manager and I go to, let's go to config manager server, and I go under administration site configuration on the site, I can use this option at the top here called hierarchy settings. And under hierarchy settings, you see this option, use a fallback site. So specify a site in the hierarchy to which clients are assigned when they are installed by using automatic site assignment, and they are not in a bounding group that has an assigned site. So in other words, a client there's no site specified for me manually, there's nothing for me in Active Directory. Does that mean I remain siteless? You can say, hey, use this site as the fallback site. I only have one, so I can only specify one. So if a site is like goes through all this process and doesn't have a site, it just assigns itself to the fallback site. So that's the process for that. So after that, so fallback status point is something different. After the client has now assigned itself to a site, now it's like I know where my policy comes from because that's the whole meaning of site assignment. Site assignment means this is where my policy comes from. This is the site that defines, that controls me. This is the site that defines my policy. And you can only define the control in a primary site. So it finds a primary site like, yep, that's the site that my control will be coming from. So after that, it goes into, let me call this 2B, and it's like, now I've been assigned to a site. Now I need to download my policy from the site. And every single well, not every single communication, let me rephrase that, but majority of the communication of the client with the config manager goes through a site system role called a management point. Client downloads, so let's make that clear, downloads policies from the management point. So management point is kind of like, the control room where the site server is like, this is the policy, and passes it to the management point. So the config manager client talks to the management point, doesn't talk to the site server, doesn't talk to the database. It just goes management point, hey, what's my policy? Management point goes, here's your policy. And then config manager client goes, calculates that, applies all the policy in WMI, registry, whatever policy, applies that on the client. And maybe one of the policies says, tell me all the software that's installed on you every 1 day. So the next day is going to go, management point, I've performed your instruction. Here's all the software installed on me. Here's the report. Management point takes that report and it's like, site server, here's the information. And site server goes process, store in database. So management point is just like, I'm giving the control to the client. Client is reporting back to me. So client communications go through the management point. But here's the thing. Now I'm assigned to a site. I need to determine which management point will I be communicating with. So that's the next one. So site assignments, number one is locate management point. Now in a site, you can have multiple management points. So which is one of the things where it goes through the process of how do I determine my management point again? Again, it goes through the process of manually. Manually always wins. Like, is there anything? Because here I could have gone SMS, I think it's called SMS MP. Let's bring up the client installation for the command line. So if I go SMS MP, yeah, there we go. So not this one. So this one is does something completely different. This is a CCM setup switch. So this one does something completely different because this one is for doing installation to locate where to download the installation source files from. But SMS MP, go down, down. Yeah, this one. You see, this one is different from the one above, /MP. That one does something different. So this one, SMS MP. So I can go SMS MP equals this. In other words, specify an initial management point for configuration manager to use. If the management point only accepts HTTPS, I have to specify HTTPS here. So I can go SMS MP equals HTTPS mp.edatum.com. I can go that, and that specifies what the management point is. So I can specify that manually. Again, if it doesn't find it manually, it can look in Active Directory and say, hey, which is, if we go back to Active Directory server again, you see that exactly published in Active Directory, and you see how it locates it in Active Directory. Go back to Active Directory, go back to Active Directory users and computer. You see this one here, SMS management point. And if we dig deep into that, so let's go back and let's just right click this one and go properties, attribute editor, and let's see how it locates there. What this one is saying is, hey, For anyone that's been assigned to configuration manager site UK2, I'm a management point located in site UK2, but I can have multiple management points in site UK2. So it's saying, hey, I'm a management point, this is my name, assigned for people that are in site UK2. So the client goes, I've been installed, I've been assigned to a site. Where do I download my policy form? I need a list of the management points in my site. One could be specified manually. So actually, you can specify many management points manually. I think you can use a comma or something like that to specify multiple. Um, that may need to be confirmed, but I think you can specify multiple management points. I think. So again, you specify the management point manually. If not, it's going to look in Active Directory. Then, if not in Active Directory, then the one that Abdul mentioned, DNS. So if you go back to DNS, you see the DNS record, the service record. Under DNS, you see, if I go under TCP, because the TCP service, under my domain TCP, I can see MSSMS MP UK. So you can say, hey, if you're located in UK2, hey, I'm a management point that you can use. So you can say to DNS, give me a list of all the management points located in UK2, site UK2. You can say to Active Directory, hey, give me a list of all the management points located in site UK2. And if I have multiple, it will return multiple. And it can use any management point located within the site. So it can use that method. And then I think after that, I think you can use wins also in case it doesn't find in DNS. But then here's another one to notice is that manually here, another thing that can happen is if I go, let's go down here. After, if I don't specify one manually, you can use Active Directory and use all that. There's another option that they have in and config manager, the latest version, where you can actually say here, when it's querying Active Directory, you can specify something sort of like a default management point in config manager. So whenever config manager replies, whenever Active Directory replies with multiple management points, the client goes and says, hey, what's my default management point out of all this list? I'm going to use that one first. And I'm going to continue using that one until it fails. Then I'm going to try to use others in Active Directory. So the way to configure that in the latest version, which I don't think I have installed in my lab environment, but the way to configure that is the same thing, the same way you configure in boundary groups. If I go under boundary groups, um, the same way I can specify and say, hey, use this for site assignment. I can say these are your site system servers. And I can go ahead and add a management point and say, if you're in this boundary group, use this management point first and tie you to a management point. And this is really, really useful because as I mentioned last week, in my environment, all of a sudden I noticed that, okay, we have all these management points located around the world, but everybody is talking to the management point in the UK. So now we have to make changes to that and stuff. So that's the thing to realize. So that's like what happens whenever you're installing the client. And then after it locates the management point, then it downloads the policy, then management can start. And by management starting, you can now start managing the client. So you go to your config manager server and says, actually, I want all these clients, I want them to give me a list of their hardware inventory every 2 hours. And you go enter. And that's packaged in the policy, passed to the management point. So when next the client goes, management point, any new policy for me, the management point gives the policy, the clients that you've installed on the machine applies those policy and starts reporting back every 2 hours. Here's my hardware inventory. Every 2 hours, here's my hardware inventory. And that's what happens. And the way, so after all this has taken place, then we can now move to the next step of now the client is on the machine. It's been assigned to a site. It's located at the management point. Again, if I go back to the clients that we installed it on, if I go back here, you see under general, it's like, yep, here's my management point. I have an assigned management point that I've discovered. I'm assigned to this site. Now you can start to manage me. I'm talking to this guy every now and then. Now management can start. And by management, what we can now do is we can go on the LBS system, so we can go on the administration, and this is where we'll pick up from next week on the site settings, and now we can begin management. I can go and say, I want to disable this setting, and I disable it. So for example, if I go computer agent, how often do they talk to the management point? I can go client policy, for example. Client policy polling interval every 60 minutes. So every 60 minutes, the client will talk to the management point. Any new policy for me, if I want, I can say, hey, set this to every 15 minutes. I want you to talk to the management point every 15 minutes. Go, okay. What that will do is that's packaged in the form of a policy put on the management point. So when next the client talks to management point and says, any policy for me, management point says, yes, there's been a change. I want you to contact me every 15 minutes from now on. So the client goes there, applies that in WMI, and then every 15 minutes, management point, any new thing for me, and start taking that. So from next week, we'll pick up with client settings. What does this settings mean? Um, the best way to configure the settings. So we'll pick up from there, and then maybe how to troubleshoot policy application and all that stuff. So another thing that I just want to mention quickly to end is that Configuration Manager 2012, after you've installed the client, it actually tries to maintain the client. So if I go back to my client one here, if I go on the computer management and I go on the schedule task, see that Configuration Manager during the installation process has set up a task here under Microsoft, and you can see under Configuration Manager, you can see it set up a task here, and the task is Client Manager Health Evaluation. So in other words, I'm going to be evaluating my health this often, and then you find that under action, it's just running this file, ccmsetup.exe. So if I go to C Windows, CCM, ccmsetup.exe. Yep, this one. So that's why it's running. It's just running ccmsetup.exe, and it runs that every day. So it configures that automatically in the background, and that happens every day, I think, between 12 and 1 a.m. Somebody says, what happens if the machine is off between 12 and 1 a.m.? When next you restart the machine, it's going to run it. So if your machine is off overnight, and then you come in Monday morning, and then you start your machine, it's going to run CCM eval and evaluate the health. And what it's actually doing by evaluating the health is this. It's running this exe, but it's going through the instructions in this file, ccmeval.xml. So I can go open with Notepad and see. So it's going through all these settings like verifying that WMI service exists. Uh, it's verifying that the startup type is okay. So it's going through like all these steps and verifying that the client is healthy. And actually, for some of the steps, if the client is not healthy, it can self-repair. So it has, for example, now, if I go, I can actually just do the last demonstration. If I go here, go on the services on my machine, administrative tools, go on the services. And what I can do is I can go and pick the configuration manager, SMS. Let's find that. SMS agent host. So this is the configuration manager agent service. So I can go and actually, so you can see it's running now, right? I can go and say stop it. And after stopping it, I can go and right click on it and say don't let stop it, go under properties and disable it and go apply. So now I've stopped it. So now this guy can't even talk to the management point. But what happens is at 12 to 1 a.m., it has a random offset. So at 12 to 1 a.m., the ccmeval.exe is going to kick in and start running. So actually, if I go back to this schedule task, right click here and click run now. So look at what will happen. So remember, I have stopped I've stopped SMS agent host, right? I've stopped it. I've set it to disabled. Now it runs this, every morning, or if the machine is shut down, it runs it whenever the machine comes back on. And let's just refresh and make sure it's completed. Yeah, operation completed successfully. Now, if I go back here and refresh this, you can see SMS agent host is back running. I just stopped it now. I just disabled it now. So it can actually self-remediate and look for issues. And this is broken. I'm going to fix this. And that happens every night. So that's a really good thing with Configuration Manager 2012 is that it can um, self-remediate the client. And it does that. So you can find that there's a good Microsoft documentation again on that on um, ccmsetup.exe. So there's a good documentation that Microsoft has on client health, configuration manager, client health. Um, there's one that I'm particularly looking for where Microsoft lists what the checks is doing, what the remediation has, some that can be remediated, some that can't be. Okay, actually, let me just go to my textbook. That'll probably be much easier. Skill pipe. Um, let's quickly bring this one up. So just to show you which ones can self-remediate, which one it cannot self-remediate. But it's a really good one. So configuration manager, monitoring. Yeah, let's go down here. Okay. So let's expand this, make it larger. Save. Yeah, good. So you can see these are all the checks that it's running. So whenever it triggers CCM eval.exe, ccmsetup.exe goes through all the configuration in the ccmsetup.xml file. So Microsoft strongly recommends do not. So a few people, you see, a few people can go and you can edit this file and actually modify this to do more tests, more checks. But Microsoft strongly recommends don't touch this file. So, and I'll echo the same thing. So just leave the file. So it does the check and it can do some remediations. And the ones I do, so it verifies that WMI service exists. If it doesn't exist, sorry, it can remediate that. So that's badly damaged. If the WMI service does not even exist at all. If the service exists, but the the startup type has been disabled, like I did now, it's going to set it to automatic. If the service is not running, it's going to start it. If the WMI repository integrity test is showing that it failed, it's going to reinstall the client. If it's seeing issues with WMI, it's going to reset the WMI repository. So it's actually doing like a lot of self-healing here, and it goes through like all these steps and checks them one by one. Some has no automatic remediation, some it can auto remediate. And then when it does all that, it's going to report that back to your config manager server. So I can go to my config manager server and go under monitoring, under client status, under client check, and it's going to report back and tell me, hey, this client, because again, that's all that's going on in the background. It runs that every night, right? And then after it does that, it reports back and says, here's the report of the activity that I concluded. Is it successful? Did it fail? And so you can actually see, okay, this client have failed the client check. And actually, you can also run reports to see when it ran the remediation, which one was successful, which one failed. So you can actually run, I think, is it queries or report? I think it's reports. You can actually run reports on that. Okay, I know the reason why. Because I've not set up my server for reporting, which we'll probably do at a later Hangout. So we can set this up for reporting. We have to install the SQL Server reporting services and all that, but we'll do that at a later time. So I hope that was really helpful. So any questions with regards to with what we've discussed now, Abdul? Okay, Abdul asked a question. If I have one primary site and distribution point in remote locations, can I install MP role on the same server as distribution point? Yeah, sure, you can. You can install, yeah, definitely. You can install the management point role. So actually, like if I'm doing architecture for config manager, I have like a principle I follow. The principle is simple. Anything that client facing, so let's say this is my config manager site server. So site server, let's say I have a site here in US, I have a site here in UK. I'm not sure. Yeah, let's say I have a site here again, and I have another one here in Saudi. So what I can do is I can go um, on this site, put a management point on this site, like what I've just said, and then use boundary groups to tie machines in this location, use it to tie them to this particular management point and on that. But what I usually like to do is I like to separate anything that's client facing from the site server. So I have a management point there. I separate it from the site server. So you can have management points, distribution points, you can have multiple roles installed on this server. But if it's client facing, like separating them from the site server. And the reason for that is for part of resiliency. Because what happens if something were to take out this server, this management point, it caches the policy. So it has a cache of the policy. So clients can still carry on talking to this guy and getting policy information while I'm trying to fix this guy in the back end. So if something happens to the site server, it doesn't, because if something happens to the site server and my management point is also on this one, that means clients are like, hey, I can't communicate, what's going on? But if it's separate, hey, the last policy that was cached on this server, they will still be able to get that while I'm busy working, fixing the main guy in the background. So I like separating, client-facing roles from the site server role. And then what can happen is if something were to happen, so this is an interesting one. If I have multiple management points, let's say I have another management point with distribution point installed on this server here. And what could happen is this guy actually fails also. So now this client, it's in a comma, right? Because the guy I'm supposed to be talking to, getting policy from, it failed. What am I going to do? What I can do now is I can use group policy. I can configure a group policy setting that will change the registry key on this machine to start using this management point. So kind of like for resiliency. So I can just go configure a group policy object, look for the registry key that controls, because everything comes down to registry keys, everything. So look for the registry key that controls which management point is talking to, modify that in registry key, and then all of a sudden this guy can start talking to this other management point. So that's one thing that I like doing whenever I'm doing config manager. So any other questions apart from that? Any other questions? So yeah, carry on, Shella. Carry on, Shella. And you're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Oh, okay. No, so because skill
Hear
pipe is
me?
something. Yeah. So skill pipe is so because I did the official Microsoft course. So if you do the official Microsoft course and you pay this crazy amount of money to Microsoft, you go to like a training center and then they give you code for like different training that you go for. So it's kind of like the
Oh,
Microsoft official course one. So they're kind of like a course provider. So you can't buy books from them directly. You have to go for the course and then you get the code for the book. Yeah.
okay, I
So
see.
majority of like what we're going through is are things that are in this Microsoft official course. We're just going through it from top to bottom. Yeah.
Okay,
So that not everyone has to go pay £2,500 to Microsoft to do some sort of training and stuff like that. Uh, yeah, so that's where that comes from. But actually, Microsoft has really, really good books that are free on Configuration Manager. So let me look that up. So if you just go for Microsoft Press free ebooks. I know I have many on my Kindle. So free ebooks from Microsoft Press. They have many on Configuration Manager, and I was going through one where they went into like huge details on the software update point of Configuration Manager, and it was really good, really, really good. So yeah, so this is one I was going through. Microsoft System Center Software Update Management Field Experience. Really, really good book.
oh wow.
Extremely practical. And these are all free books. So they have one that's just introducing to Microsoft System Center 2012, how to introducing. So these are like free books from Microsoft that are good on that. So I'll post that in the chat window. Um, so Abdul and everyone, are you confident now that you understand all the process that we've gone through? Are you confident that you understand, what's going on in the background? So somebody's like, you know, If I'm using site assignment, how do I troubleshoot if something is failing? You can trace it step by step. You can go through this step one by one and figure out where exactly has this failed. If you're doing site assignment and you're like, okay, this the installation completed successfully, but the client is not assigning itself to a site, you can figure out, did I specify anything manually? Is something wrong with my Active Directory publishing? Have I not configured a fallback site so that in case these two fail, they can use a fallback site? So then I can determine where it failed. Assuming they are assigned to a site, but they are having trouble downloading policy. So you can confirm if they have downloaded policy by checking the installation installed enabled, which component is installed and enabled. If you see some components enabled, it means they successfully downloaded policy. But if you're like, okay, everything is showing as installed, but nothing is enabled, you can figure out, okay, it seems as if these guys are having problem locating a management point. That's specifying anything manually, anything in Active Directory. So there will be a point that will go through the log files also for all this. So the DNS issues, the WINS issue, and all that. So any other questions regarding this? Any other questions? Yep, Abdul, what's the question? Um, so did you say you have a question, Abdul? So actually, let's ask the. I think they usually have some questions at the end of this. So Abdul says, yeah. So those are really good. So Shala, so these are really good books that Abdul posted also on Config Manager. So these books like System Center 2012, Mastering the Fundamentals. Although I must mention this, Abdul. So I actually also all these books you've mentioned, every single one of them. If I bring up my Kindle, every single one of them, I have them, and I think I've gone through almost every single one of them. I'll tell you what those books are good for. They're good if you're getting into Config Manager. They're good because they will guide you to. So I go back to my library. So I have all of them. Tangalon, Advanced Deployment, Deployment Fundamentals, Enterprise Client. I have all the books by those guys. But I tell you what they're good for. They're good for if you're going step by step because you can walk through them and they can take you like they take like a scenario so you can walk, build your own lab and go through everything step by step. But one thing I've found that they are not good for is they don't go into details. Like the kind of detail that we discussed now, talking about what's going on in the background, which you need, when things start failing. So these books are good when you're configuring, yeah? You can go through them as guide for configuring. But now when things start failing, then you need to know the details of what's going on in the background for you to troubleshoot. So that's when some of the Microsoft ones, like these free ones, are really, really good. Troubleshooting the configuration manager, they go into a lot of backend details. So that's when these ones are really good. So these ones, I agree with you, they're good, but mainly they are good for if you're building your lab, they will introduce you to the concept and that. So okay, I think there's like a question that Microsoft, yeah, a module review. Let's see if we can, let's see how many of these questions we can get. In your environment, do your users, okay, yeah, let's ignore this. Which site systems would you deploy to support internet-based client? Anyone has any idea of this? I know we didn't talk about it much, but Abdul, site systems would you deploy to support internet-based clients? Yep, anyone? I know we've not talked about this one. We'll probably talk about this one more when we're talking about the settings. So yeah, it's talking about you need your management point, but it has to be HTTPS. It has to be secure. You can't use HTTP communication. So what is the danger of putting a fallback status point on the internet? Again, we've not gone through this one in details. This one is talking about fallback status point, which we've not talked about because we've only talked about fallback side. Fallback status point is only does HTTP, so which is not secure. So which deployment method will you use the most in your environment? Abdul, what do you think? Which deployment method will you use most in your environment? Or Chris or Bob, anyone? Client push, yeah. Usually people will use client push because it's just automated, everything works slowly. But what's the disadvantage of client push, Abdul? What's the disadvantage that you cannot use ccmsetup.exe installation properties. So that's the thing with that. Okay, so I think that's where we'll stop for today. Yeah, so today we really went like all the way because it's almost 11 o'clock already. But that was a really good one. So I'll post the recording now. If you have any questions or anything, post it in the community. We'll have a look at that. I'll post the recording of this Hangout also.
Sounds good.
Yep. So yeah, if anyone has no other questions, I think we'll just call it a good Hangout and just meet again next week. So have a wonderful evening, guys.
You too, David. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no problem. Yeah, see you.
Yeah.
Yeah, see you.